This narrow, shadowed strait is one of the most critical maritime choke points on Earth. The Dardanelles, a razor-thin strip of water slicing Europe from Asia, connecting the Mediterranean to the Black Sea. For centuries, empires used this exact gateway to project terrifying power. Today, 40,000 massive vessels fight through these waters every year, carrying crude oil and grain to keep the global economy alive. It is a lifeline, a single pivot point holding global energy security together. Then, in early August 2026, the water went dead quiet. Without a single public announcement, the Turkish government silently began freezing transit permits for ships bound for Russia's massive Novorossiysk port. Massive tankers scheduled to pass through were suddenly ordered to hold, indefinitely. No explanations, no timelines. The ships sat frozen on the water, engine rooms humming in confusion. The silence from Ankara was deafening, and the hidden data trailing behind this sudden shutdown exposed a brutal reality. In June, Turkey imported 1.2 million tons of oil from Russian ports. By July, that number plummeted to 900,000 tons, a staggering 25% crash in just 30 days, according to trader sources and LSEG shipping data. But deeper in the Black Sea, the real nightmare was unfolding. Direct shipments from Russia's Black Sea ports to Turkey were cut in half, dropping from 600,000 tons down to barely 300,000 tons. The bleeding hasn't stopped either. Shipping data projects Turkey will receive only around 200,000 tons of oil from Russian Black Sea ports in August, and only 2 tankers are currently scheduled to make that delivery, both carrying Kazakh Kebco crude. Not a single shipment of CPC blend or Russian Urals crude has been scheduled for Turkey this entire month, a category that used to flow steadily and now sits completely empty on the books. The trigger behind that collapse traces directly back to Ukraine's own escalating campaign against Russian energy infrastructure. Ukraine intensified its strikes on Russia's Black Sea terminals through July, forcing a full week-long shutdown of exports from the Caspian Pipeline Consortium terminal and leaving loading operations at Novorossiysk itself wildly unpredictable. That single week of disruption alone dragged CPC's total July shipments down by 20%. The danger isn't limited to pipelines and port infrastructure either. It's now landing directly on the ships themselves. On August 3rd, a drone strike hit the ro-ro cargo vessel Nadezhda, roughly 20 nautical miles off Novorossiysk, leaving 3 crew members in serious condition. That same day, a second vessel called the Yasar was also struck after leaving the same port. Just days later, a Turkish flagged ship named the MV Gulluk took a direct hit off Novorossiysk too, the drone slamming into the crew's living quarters, though this time everyone on board survived without injury. 3 separate vessels connected to Turkey struck in the exact same narrow stretch of water within days of each other. That's not scattered bad luck. That's a pattern violent enough to make any shipping company think twice before sending another crew anywhere near that coastline. And Turkey's own foreign minister, Hakan Fidan, didn't stay silent about it either, formally criticizing the attacks on Russia-linked tankers near its waters. Calling them alarming and warning, they directly threaten navigational safety and commerce across the entire region. Here's where the story stretches even further than the Black Sea itself. On August 12, Ukraine struck Novorossiysk's naval base with Polyanitsia jet-powered drones, Neptune missiles, and unmanned naval systems, hitting air defense positions, piers, and critical port infrastructure, with Novorossiysk's export network disrupted. Traders confirm Turkey has started diversifying its crude supply to compensate for everything falling apart at Novorossiysk. And the news sources aren't exactly next door. Rare oil shipments from Brazil and Guyana are now expected to arrive in August. Tankers crossing an entire ocean instead of a narrow inland sea, simply because that route no longer carries the same risk of getting hit by a drone. Widen the lens even further, and the numbers stop looking like an isolated Turkish problem and start looking like a full-scale assault on Russia's entire refining backbone. Since the start of August alone, Ukrainian drones have struck 10 out of 34 of Russia's major oil refineries, close to a third of every facility tied to the country's biggest oil companies. And those strikes aren't hitting one type of crude either. Both Russian Urals and CPC blend carrying Kazakh oil are getting caught in the same net, meaning Ukraine's campaign is disrupting multiple producing nations at once, not just Russia alone. To understand exactly how much pain Turkey's pullback is inflicting on Moscow, you need to know something most people outside the oil trade never realize. Turkey isn't just some ordinary customer buying Russian crude on the side. Turkey is the single largest buyer of Russian refined oil products on the entire planet, purchasing somewhere between 25 and 27% of every barrel of refined product Russia ships anywhere in the world. Heading into 2026, Russia supplied roughly 85% of all of Turkey's diesel imports. That's not a trading relationship, that's dependency running in both directions at once. Here's the twist that makes Turkey's position truly unique. When the EU and the G7 slammed a direct embargo on Russian seaborne oil, they effectively slammed the door shut across almost the entire Western world. Turkey became the one major exception left standing inside that alliance's own orbit, the single largest buyer of Russian oil anywhere in the NATO-aligned sphere. While Western capitals were publicly condemning Moscow's oil trade, Turkish refineries kept the pipeline running wide open. And those refineries weren't simply burning that oil for domestic use either. Two specific Turkish refining giants, Star and Tüpraş, have been legally importing discounted Russian crude, refining it into finished products, and then re-exporting that same fuel straight back into G7 and EU countries. In plain terms, Turkey became the laundering point for Russian oil, turning sanctioned crude into unsanctioned diesel and gasoline that European countries could legally buy without technically touching Moscow at all. Now this is where things are getting out of hand. Before we reveal what happened next, hit that like button and subscribe to the Frontline Show. We're tracking how Ukraine's relentless strikes are squeezing Russia's energy lifeline. Trust us, you don't want to miss what comes next. Look at the global scoreboard, and Turkey's role gets even stranger. China buys somewhere between 48 and 50% of all Russian crude exports worldwide, and India grabs another 36 to 37%. Turkey sits far behind both of them, pulling in only around 6% of raw crude. But flip the conversation from crude oil to refined products, and Turkey suddenly dominates the trade in a way neither China nor India comes close to matching. Turkey isn't buying Russia's oil to burn it. Turkey is buying Russia's oil to transform it into something the rest of the West can legally purchase. That dependency cuts sharply the other direction too, and it's now backfiring on Turkey itself in an almost poetic way. Because Russia relies so heavily on Turkey as a diesel supplier, and because Russia has separately slapped its own export ban on domestic diesel to protect its own shrinking fuel reserves, Turkey is now stuck in a genuine fuel squeeze of its own. Ankara is scrambling to find alternative diesel suppliers and paying steep premium prices to do it. Three separate forces are converging to squeeze this trade relationship shut all at once. First, US secondary sanctions targeting Lukoil and Rosneft, Russia's two biggest oil exporters by far, in order to pressure Kremlin into ending the war in Ukraine, have narrowed the pool of banking channels and tanker operators that Turkish refiners are even legally allowed to work with anymore. Second, physical infrastructure at Russia's own Black Sea terminals keeps getting hammered by drone strikes. Third, the maritime security risk from those same drone attacks is making Turkish shipping companies genuinely nervous about sending vessels anywhere near that coastline at all. That third pressure point isn't just theoretical panic either. It's already reshaping how Turkey buys oil. Turkey's diversification toward Kazakhstan, Brazil, and Guyana isn't some temporary workaround anymore. It has hardened into a real structural shift, replacing volumes that Turkish refiners once treated as untouchable thanks to geographic proximity and steep price discounts. And the scale of what's actually at stake here reaches far beyond Turkey's own borders. The G7 has imported roughly 1.8 billion euros worth of Turkish oil products refined from Russian crude. meaning Ukraine's Black Sea strikes are quietly disrupting a sanctions workaround that's been letting billions in Russian oil revenue slip through Turkish refineries and straight into European markets completely legally. That number exposes exactly why Turkey's public moratorium proposal isn't purely humanitarian in nature. Ankara genuinely wants these Black Sea attacks to stop, but not simply out of concern for regional stability. Every strike on Novorossiysk is tearing directly into Turkey's own energy supply chain and Turkey's own refining profits. This creates a real headache for NATO, too. There's a real cost buried inside this pivot, one that could reshape Turkey's refining business for years to come. Brazilian and Guyanese crude means longer shipping distances and higher prices, cutting directly into the profit margins that made Star and Tuprosh so competitive in the first place. Put simply, Ukraine's drone campaign has managed to accomplish something years of Western sanctions pressure never fully achieved. It physically forced Turkey to start structurally cutting its dependence on Russian energy, not through diplomatic pressure or economic threats, but by making Russian supply too dangerous, too unreliable, and too legally complicated to keep buying at the old volumes. Here's where this story stops being about oil tankers entirely, and turns into something Moscow genuinely cannot ignore. On August 3rd, the US State Department formally notified Congress that Turkey plans to transfer a massive weapons package to Ukraine, and Washington confirmed it stands ready to authorize the deal. The package carries a headline value of $256 million, though the official notification documents actually list the combined original acquisition value closer to $283.9 million, two different figures describing the exact same transfer. What's actually inside that package should stop you cold. Turkey is offering up its entire fleet of 12 M270 rocket launchers alongside 70 M39 ATACMS ballistic missiles, each one carrying 165 kilometers of range and packed with 950 individual submunitions apiece. Do the math on just that single missile type, and you land on 66,500 separate submunitions in the ATACMS portion alone. And the ATACMS missiles are only where this package starts. The proposal also includes 2,524 M26 rockets, each one carrying 644 submunitions, adding up to more than 1.6 million individual submunitions in that category alone. Then comes the heaviest piece of the entire deal: 47,000 M509 A1 artillery shells, each packed with 180 submunitions, totaling a staggering 8.46 million submunitions just from the artillery component. Add every category together, and the full package contains 10,151,956 individual explosive submunitions, one of the largest cluster munition transfers recorded at any point in this entire war. Turkey's official explanation for offering up its own stockpile sounds almost mundane next to those numbers. Ankara describes this as routine housekeeping, phasing out obsolete legacy inventory and redirecting the resulting funds toward modernizing its existing military systems. But Human Rights Watch isn't buying that framing at all. The organization formally called on Congress on August 11th to block the entire transfer outright, warning that these are decades-old legacy weapons whose unexploded submunitions create landmine-like hazards for civilians for years after any conflict actually ends. Russia's own reaction tells you everything about how seriously Moscow is taking this. Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova warned publicly that the transfer would cause serious damage to Russia's relationship with both Ankara and Washington, and she formally demanded explanations from both governments. That's not a routine diplomatic complaint. That's the kind of language Moscow reserves for developments it genuinely cannot brush aside. Here's a detail that adds an uncomfortable layer to this entire story. Turkey formally declared at both the 2023 and 2024 United Nations Convention meetings on cluster munitions that it had not used, produced, imported, or transferred a single cluster munition since 2005. This proposed transfer directly contradicts that public declaration, on the record in front of the very body Turkey made those promises to. None of this exists inside a strict legal vacuum either, and that's exactly why the deal is technically able to move forward at all. Turkey, the United States, Russia, and Ukraine are all non-signatories to the 2008 Convention on Cluster Munitions, meaning this transfer creates no direct treaty violation for any single country involved. That legal gray zone is precisely what allows a deal this size to even reach the negotiating table in the first place. This also isn't some unprecedented first for Washington either, even if the scale here is quite massive. The Biden administration carried out at least 7 separate cluster munition transfers to Ukraine between July 2023 and October 2024. What Turkey is proposing now represents a continuation of that same established policy, just executed through a different supplier and at a considerably larger scale than anything sent before it. Ukraine's own stated reasoning for wanting this exact package cuts straight to the point. According to the official State Department notification, Ukraine wants these systems specifically to strengthen its offensive and defensive fire support capability against the Russian invasion, and the notification itself confirms Kyiv already operates munitions of essentially the same type. In other words, this isn't introducing some entirely new category of weapon onto the battlefield. It's scaling up firepower Ukraine already has, dramatically, all at once, and with a 165-kilometer range on those ATACMS missiles, giving Ukrainian forces reach deep into Russian-occupied territory and Russian border regions alike. Step back, and you can see exactly why this single transfer complicates everything else happening in this story. The same country quietly turning away Russian oil tankers at the Dardanelles is simultaneously asking Washington's permission to hand Ukraine over 10 million explosive submunitions. Turkey isn't picking a side here in any traditional sense. Turkey is running 2 completely different playbooks against Russia at the exact same time. One economic, one military, and Moscow has absolutely no way to force Ankara to choose just one. As the Montreux Convention grants Ankara sovereign authority to regulate traffic for immediate navigational safety in Black Sea, it is quietly exploiting a genuine gray area buried inside the treaty itself, using the surge in sea drone attacks as legal cover to stall Russian-bound cargo under what officials call maritime safety protocols, all while technically keeping the treaty's peacetime free transit guarantee fully intact on paper. That legal maneuvering carries a consequence Russia genuinely cannot undo. Turkey's strict denial of new warship passage through the straits means every single vessel in Russia's Black Sea fleet that gets sunk or crippled by Ukraine stays permanently gone, with absolutely no way for Moscow to sail in a replacement. Ukraine has already sunk or crippled more than 1/3 of that entire fleet through sea, drone, and missile strikes, and Turkey's straight lockdown guarantees that damage isn't some temporary battlefield setback. It's permanent. Turkey isn't working alone on this front either, and that detail matters more than it might first appear. Ankara is actively coordinating with fellow NATO members Romania and Bulgaria to clear naval mines and secure a genuinely safe shipping corridor specifically for Ukrainian grain. In practice, that makes Turkey an active partner in breaking Russia's own attempted naval blockade, not a neutral bystander simply watching from the sidelines. By choking off commercial traffic bound for Novorossiysk, Turkey is hitting something far more valuable to Moscow than shipping schedules. That single port funds Russia's war effort through crude oil, grain, and fertilizer exports flowing through it, meaning Turkey's pressure campaign is landing directly on the financial engine, keeping Russia's entire military machine running. Now, here's the twist. The Montreux Convention actually gives Turkey a far more powerful tool, sitting completely unused on the shelf: the ability to invoke wartime provisions and close the straits entirely. Turkey has never touched that option. Instead, these selective permit delays are quietly achieving nearly the same practical effect, choking off Russian traffic without triggering the diplomatic firestorm and legal consequences that a formal closure would immediately unleash. The personal relationship at the very top of this entire dynamic has cooled just as sharply as the shipping lanes themselves. Erdogan and Putin last spoke by phone on April 3rd, and that months-long silence represents a genuinely significant shift in what used to be one of the most active, closely maintained personal relationships between any two heads of state anywhere in the world. Turkey did try the diplomatic route first, and Russia's response tells you exactly how threatening Moscow finds this entire pressure campaign. Turkey formally transmitted Ukraine's own proposed Black Sea shipping moratorium directly to Russia, offering a genuine off-ramp to de-escalate the maritime violence. Russia rejected it outright, declaring that a ceasefire would simply hand Ukraine what officials called a temporary respite. That single rejection confirms Moscow views this entire Black Sea squeeze as a real, existential threat, not some minor inconvenience it can simply wait out. Layer the ATACMS transfer on top of everything else happening here, and the picture changes dramatically. This marks the very first time Turkey has explicitly authorized American-made ballistic missiles to reach Ukrainian hands, weapons capable of striking Russian naval logistics hubs and air bases anywhere across the entire Black Sea region. Pull every thread together, and Turkey is playing an almost unbelievable number of roles at the exact same moment. Turkey enforces the Montreux Convention. Turkey facilitates a massive arms transfer to Ukraine. Turkey builds warships for the Ukrainian Navy. Turkey coordinates mine clearance operations with fellow NATO members. And Turkey controls the shipping permits, deciding which vessels even reach Novorossiysk in the first place. Together, those 5 roles amount to a genuine strategic encirclement of Russia's entire Black Sea position, achieved without Turkey ever formally abandoning its neutrality or officially joining the Western sanctions regime against Moscow. So here's the question worth sitting with as this story keeps developing. Turkey is simultaneously buying oil from Russia and arming Ukraine against it, all at the exact same time, and neither Moscow nor Washington holds enough leverage to force Ankara to finally pick one side. How much longer can any country actually sustain playing both hands of a war this brutal before one side finally forces the choice Turkey has spent years trying to avoid? Turkey isn't the only place where Russia's grip is visibly slipping right now either. Back on Russian soil, an entirely different kind of shortage is quietly spreading through the country's own gas stations, and that's exactly the story we broke down in our last video. We showed you how a second wave of fuel shortages is now hitting Russia harder than the first, with queues forming across multiple regions as the same Ukrainian strikes rattling the Black Sea start choking off fuel inside Russia itself. If watching Turkey balance both sides of this war caught your attention, wait until you see what happens when the country actually fighting the war can't even keep its own gas stations running. Go watch it next, because between empty tanks at home and vanishing oil shipments abroad, the full weight of the pressure closing in on Russia becomes impossible to ignore. This is the Frontline Show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.